Hey everybody, it's your old pal John. I hope you're all doing well. Again, my apologies for a long time between videos, but this Afghan family does come first. I'm sure you understand that. My friend and yours, probably, Paul McCartney, is, I think, probably one of the, has to be in the top 20 most influential artists, and I say artists liberally, in the 20th century. So I'm a huge fan. I love hearing stories about him. I've heard some of them, and I guess it starts here with Patrick Stewart story, and I have not heard about this one, I don't think. So let's get into it.
Patrick Stewart's story. Captain Jean-Luc Picard met all sorts of interesting characters on his adventures, but none made the man behind the character quite as nervous as one Sir Paul McCartney. Back when Patrick was acting in theatre productions, he once remarked to his co-star, who was Paul's girlfriend at the time, that he'd love an Aston Martin.
He's in the show tonight. He's come to see Jane Asher with his
Jane
girlfriend.
Asher, yes.
To his surprise, a couple of weeks later, he heard a knock on his dressing room door. It was Paul McCartney. Unfortunately for Stewart, he was in just his undies.
Jane tells me that you like Aston Martins. Here, drive this.
That's when Paul threw him the keys to an Aston Martin and insisted they all go for a long drive. Stewart obliged,
Wow.
but couldn't quite enjoy himself, as all he could think about was that if he crashed the car, his name would be etched in history for the wrong reason.
It's the only thing I will be remembered for. This is the man who killed Paul McCartney.
Number 9.
And well, if it was 1966, I think it was 66, when he had that car accident and they came up with the idea that Paul is dead, that would be interesting. I didn't hear that about Patrick Stewart. As a matter of fact, I didn't know he was acting in the 60s. I gotta be honest, I'm not really up on my Patrick Stewart, but that's a pretty cool thing. Yeah, he dated Jane Asher, for a while, and then, I mean, say what you want about Paul McCartney. I think he's probably the most tame of a lot of rock stars, but I think there was some infidelity going on there in that marriage. But he did live with her for like a year. That's when he wrote that song for her brother. And he used that. Anyway. All right, guys.
Steve Holly's story. In the days after the Beatles, Paul lived a quieter life in the countryside for a period of time. It was there that he met Steve Holly, who would eventually become the drummer for his band Wings. During a
Right.
Beatles Fest panel, Steve allegedly told a story of a night out drinking he had with Paul. The two were walking down the streets in the middle of the night, absolutely sloshed. All of a sudden, Paul turns to Steve and asks, "Do you hear a horse coming?" When Steve said yes, Paul exclaimed, "Oh no, that's my wife." Apparently, Linda would come find Paul on horseback when he would go out drinking, and after giving him a stern talking to, she'd make him hop on the back of the horse and carry him home. Number 8.
I could not imagine Paul McCartney drunk. That must be like the coolest night ever. Man, I'm totally fanboying over that. But I don't know. I always thought that Linda McCartney was a lot cooler, and I didn't think of like Paul McCartney as a kind of person who would go out and get sloshed. But of course, in his younger days, why not?
Bill Bailey's story. We've all found ourselves being starstruck when meeting a celebrity.
Yeah.
Even other celebrities experience the same, apparently.
Yeah,
Comedian
notice.
Bill Bailey of Black Book's fame recalled the time he met Paul while on stage. In his head, he had this elaborate speech to make about how profoundly impacted he was by hearing a Beatle live.
And I thought,
Yeah.
if ever I get to meet Paul McCartney, I want to try and tell him. I want to try and try and describe this experience. Because I bet no one's ever told him how brilliant he is.
Only it came out completely wrong, apparently.
Because I was so nervous. I went, your songs, like, with a tapestry and everything, like a thread with a...
The story gets harder and harder to listen to as Bill keeps struggling to get his words out.
That would be
I try and
embarrassing.
tell this story to Paul McCartney. Doesn't come out quite right. This is how it comes out. Paul. Actually, Tony Bennett, he went, whoa.
When saying their goodbyes, Bill left Paul with a gift he wouldn't soon forget.
He goes, just as an afterthought, he looked at me and went, "I'll be watching you on the TV." And I turned to him and I went, "And I'll be watching you." And I poked him in the eye.
Number 7.
That's hilarious. Oh man, I gotta tell you, I would love to ask Paul McCartney questions. I see him, I read all these interviews and watch all these interviews. I watch them. I don't really read them anymore, but I have so many questions because he gets asked the same questions over and over again, and I feel like I know the answer to all these questions. I would love to interview Paul McCartney. That would be like my dream come true. Like I would die a happy man. But yeah, I mean, I hear so many people come up and be like, Paul, I can't tell you what you mean to me, you know, and your music has meant to me, this kind of stuff. And it's neat watching this, but at the same time, you just see Paul he's so, I don't want to say normal about it, but it's not like he's just like, oh, wow, like, that's the best thing to ever hear in the world. He's like, I know, it's weird that I'm an average person, I made this. But anyway.
Rob Lowe's story.
And I walked in and Paul McCartney was there. And I was like, I could barely eat.
Film and TV star Rob Lowe is another one who's been lucky enough to sit down and have a meal with Paul. As he recalls it, as they were eating, one of Paul's songs came on. He caught Paul singing along.
And he's literally sitting there and he's like, so if you want some fun, take old blah dee blah da. And he looks up at me and he sees that I've seen him. And then he turns red and gets embarrassed. Then I get embarrassed that I've seen him do it.
What makes this story so hilarious, though, is Lowe's horrendous impression of McCartney.
Yeah.
And then he doesn't really know what to say, and he looks at me and says, oh, it's not even really a lyric. It just sort of popped into my head at the time. I mean, what does it mean?
Sorry, where is he from at this point?
This is like me telling a joke.
It's enough to distract you from what the story is even about. It ends with Paul being told off by his daughter for pretending to not know what his lyrics meant.
If you want some fun, take oh blah dee blah da. What does it mean? I don't know what it means. And his daughter, I'll never forget, said, Dad, you're an idiot. You know what it means. It meant take drugs.
Number 6.
Oh, man. All right, I'm kind of curious about halfway through this, or maybe a little less. I'm not sure. What question would you ask Paul McCartney if you had a chance to talk with him? Obviously, I'm an Uber fan, but if you are too, I would love to read that in the comments.
Nat Wolff's story.
Entire life, I used to write Paul McCartney letters, and give it to. I'd hear you'd be at a restaurant. I'd write him a letter. I'd give it to the host.
While Nat Wolff's portrayal of Light in the horrendous Death Note adaptation left many fans in tears, it was Nat himself who was blubbering after this experience.
I gotta see this movie.
Nat's been a McCartney fan his whole life, even dressing up as him on Halloween when he was younger. So when the opportunity arrived to meet him, as the two were in the same restaurant, Nat seized the day. Well, he tried to, at least.
My friend said, I think you need to sit down. As I'm sitting down, I thought like something terrible had happened. And he said, Paul McCartney's here. And like a girl, 14-year-old girl in the 60s, I just started bawling.
Much like Bailey, when meeting him, he was utterly starstruck. He just fell to pieces. But luckily, Paul, being Paul, had some kind words to say.
And then he's like, I've got a good feeling about you. Keep going with what you're doing. And I burst into tears. I just start sobbing.
Number 5.
That would, I think, and I don't know, maybe you guys would do this or two or not, but Paul McCartney has, first of all, a great way to look at things. If you've seen Carpool Karaoke, I think that's wonderful. But his answers are just so honest and like kind. He sort of reciprocates the kindness that people kind of give to him. And I don't know, that's just something about Paul McCartney.
Billy Joel's story. American musician Billy Joel once arranged with Paul and his agents to come over to his house and jam. He opened up his fridge to see what he could offer Paul while he was over, and his fridge was full to the brim with different meats.
And I'm looking at my fridge and I'm seeing, like turkey breast and, cold beef or something. And it's starting to look like Jeffrey Dahmer's refrigerator.
Yeah, he's a vegetarian.
I'm thinking if Paul opens the fridge, he's going to freak out and he's going to run out of my house.
However, if you know Paul, you know he's a prolific vegetarian. With this in mind, Joel tried to make his home as accommodating as possible and decided to hide away all the meat so that Paul wouldn't feel uncomfortable or judge him.
So I decide I'm going to take all the meat out of the refrigerator and put it somewhere else.
Right.
Literally, I was going to hide the salami. So I go through the fridge and I'm pulling out this, pulling out that, and I'm hiding it in drawers.
Fortunately, Paul never opened any of the drawers because that would have been a lot more bizarre than finding meat in the fridge.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Joel ended up forgetting he had stored the food away.
And I'm like thrilled.
that's
I'm
right, I
calling
forgot
everybody.
about that.
Paul was at the house. We were hanging out, man. We were talking music. And then, like, a few days go by, and I'm walking around my house like, what's that smell?
Number 4, Dave Grohl's story.
That's so awesome. I would love to hear Paul's reaction to these stories. That would just be amazing. Like if you knew that Billy Joel did that.
Story. Musician Dave Grohl actually has quite a few stories about hanging out with Paul.
Yeah, Dave Grohl and Paul McCartney are good friends, or at least decent friends.
After all, the two are friends. They've played together on stage, and Paul even inducted the Foo Fighters into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So it's little wonder Grohl gets a little choked up whenever he tells this story of when Paul came over to his house.
We had just had Ophelia, our youngest, and Paul and Nancy were in town. They said, like, okay, we want to come see the new baby. She was a week old.
Isn't that crazy, though, that you just think, like, Paul is such, like, a normal person. He's just, like, friend of yours. Like, yeah, I want to come see your new baby. It's like, wow, that's that he would just do that. I don't know. That's so Paul.
Apparently, on his way, Paul spotted the family's piano and couldn't help but give it a spin. That's when Grohl's daughter sat next to him, and Paul began teaching her how to play.
She sat down and she watched his hands.
What a nice guy.
They sat together and he was showing her what to play.
Even making a song together.
It was the only time I've ever taken a picture of Paul.
Oh, yeah, he doesn't like
to
those
me,
things.
I don't really want to do that. I just want to kind of be his friend.
The story does have a hilarious twist ending for when he saw his daughter the next day, but it's still a lovely one.
And I came around the corner and she looked at me as she was playing the piano. She realized I was watching and she never played the piano again. Oh, for God's sake.
Yeah,
Number
right.
3, Ringo Starr's story. The Beatles.
Yeah, okay. There are a lot of stories I think about Dave Grohl and Paul McCartney, but hearing one from Ringo would be good.
Beatles documentary Get Back was eye-opening for fans as they were treated to some never-before-seen footage of their heroes. One thing we certainly didn't expect to see was Ringo suddenly owning up to being the one who let off a fart.
If anybody let a silent one go, they would try and get away with it.
According to Starr, silent farting was a pretty common nuisance among the band. It became such a problem that they'd have to agree to announce who it was that released the stench each time so that it didn't become a witch hunt.
So anyway, we realized, okay, it was me. Or it was him. It doesn't matter, but you just said it and everything calmed down.
Right.
When asked who the gassiest Beatle was, Ringo said, you guessed it.
Paul.
Number 2.
That's hilarious. I miss seeing. I saw Ringo in like not in this time period, but like a late 1970s interview with George Harrison. I mean, he was clearly coked up out of his mind. He was just answering everything, and George was like, "Whoa there, calm down, buddy."
The Gallagher brothers stories. These brothers, known
Don't
for their
know who they
work
are.
as Oasis, have been very vocal about
right.
their love for the Beatles over the years. Lucky for them, they've both met this legend. In Noel's case, he told the story of meeting Paul at one of his homes.
And I kind of had longish hair, and he said, "Hey, you look like a Beatle." And I said, "So do you."
Paul was a very courteous host, showing off his unique house. But there's one part of their meetup that came across as a bit too intimate for Noel.
And he pressed this button, and the bed goes up into a tinier bubble. And he said, "Yeah, we used to kind of sit out here, in the '60s and look at the stars." And there's just me and him. And I was thinking,
that's crazy.
You better not try and go off me.
Liam's stories are, well, a little bit different. He's met with Paul many times and also says he's lovely. But when this interview was posted in NME, he recalled the latest interaction where McCartney offered him a margarita.
Yeah, by the way, I
Liam declined, saying he wasn't hungry, only for McCartney to give him a lashing, saying he's talking about the cocktail, not a pizza. Number 1.
What? I must have completely misunderstood that, but I'll be honest with you, I wouldn't mind having a bed that kind of had a bubble on it, went up into looking at the stars.
Kondo's story. In the conversation of greatest video game music composer of all time, Koji Kondo is certain to get a mention.
Mario Brothers.
He's responsible for some of the most iconic Nintendo tunes ever conceived. But there's one story that made even him stunned. During Paul's tour of Japan in the 80s, Koji Kondo and famed game designer Shigeru Miyamoto were invited backstage. To his shock, when McCartney approached him, he started singing the tune to Super Mario. Bear bear in mind, video games were much more niche at this time.
That's true.
So Kondo certainly wasn't expecting Paul to be a fan. Paul would go on to tell the two that while he himself was not very good at games, he would often hear the tunes as his children and grandchildren would play. Have you ever met any celebrities and walked away with hilarious stories? Let us know in those comments below.
Yeah, I met Joe Walsh one time, and I took him to an AA meeting. True story. All right, guys, let me know in the comments what you guys think, and if you have a Paul McCartney story that you want to share that maybe you've seen. Yeah, if you get a chance, look up Paul McCartney Tells a Joke. It's really funny. Talk to you guys later.